category is better birth. Our case topic is IVF surrogacy. And our main case question is it morally permissible for Thomas, Betty, and Kim to undergo this IVF surrogacy procedure? And those are our roles. Okay, so our case study was Thomas and Betty Smith were heartbroken. After 8 years of marriage and high hopes for a large loving family, the Smiths were still childless. 6 pregnancies were each followed by miscarriage, and then the bleeding began. A tumor the size of a grapefruit was removed from Betty's uterus. In the process, Betty ended up receiving a complete hysterectomy that removed her vagina, uterus, and ovaries. Now they would never be able to have children together. Not long after the surgery, an opportunity to make everything right again was made available to them. Betty's cousin, Kim, offered them the chance of a lifetime, out of compassion and without financial compensation. Using Tom's sperm and Kim's eggs, IVF would be performed, and 2 of the embryos could be implanted into Kim's uterus, and the embryos not implanted would be frozen in case there were problems in the first attempt. The babies would grow in Kim's body and then would be given back to the Smiths at delivery. What a great opportunity, Betty thought, and how relatively simple. Let's do it, she urged Tom.
Summarizing a biblical ethical position. So it's not acceptable in general, but would be acceptable under certain situations such as a rescue surrogacy. This is when a mother volunteers her womb to save the IVF created embryo that has been frozen and is destined for destruction.
So the biblically derived principle that was applicable to this case was the image principle that says we are made in the image of God, and that to disrespect, to threaten, to injure, to kill, or destroy an image is to do the same to the image it represents. So pertaining to the IVF and the embryos would be why this principle applies to this specific case. So the first Christian perspective, most Christian bioethicists find surrogacy problematic in God's will, and in our specific case, because Thomas and Betty had problems with conceiving a child, it was God's plan that they didn't have a child. And then it also violates the marital covenant. And then in our case, this applies because a third party is involved in the conception of a child using Thomas's sperm and Kim's egg.
The violation of marital covenant. Surrogacy violates creation norm by introducing a third party. Problems in marriage, such as infertility, should be shared by both spouses. This refusal to share burdens is not a biblical response to God's will.
So the biblical worldview assumptions that applies to this case, it would be morally acceptable to undergo this procedure despite Thomas and Betty's inability to have children. So it wouldn't be acceptable, even though they can't have children, it still wouldn't be acceptable in a biblical worldview. And then it is unacceptable because it is not only a husband and wife. Because they added Kim into the equation and they introduced a third party, it violates that marital covenant, and so that in the biblical worldview makes this case unacceptable morally in a biblical worldview. And Thomas and Betty went against God's will of not being able to conceive a child even after 6 tries. So even though childlessness is sad, like Thomas and Betty went against God's will in a biblical worldview, therefore it wouldn't be morally acceptable. And then the aspect of Kim not accepting financial compensation would be morally acceptable in this situation because a lot of times, which we'll elaborate on, a lot of times people are concerned about exploitation of women because of the compensation that surrogates receive. But in this case, Kim was doing it because she wanted to and not because she was receiving compensation for it. So a biblical worldview assumption, the exploitation of women, this wasn't applicable to our case because Kim didn't
want compensation, and she also gave permission for her womb to be used. But in an average surrogacy case, the wage usually ranges from $20,000 to $25,000 that the woman receives for becoming a surrogate, which is about $3 an hour while she's pregnant for the 9 months that she's carrying the child. It's a low wage for the trauma, pain, and grief of a surrogacy, and women are often not informed of the health risks that comes with being a surrogate mother.
The biblical worldview assumption, selling of children, not acceptable to this case study. Children are a gift from God, and traditionally, surrogacy is always immoral for the child is given for money. Gestational surrogacy is always immoral when embryos or games are purchased. Some Christians, Bioethics, claim that commercial surrogacy is a form of human trafficking.
General concerns about embryo-destructive reproductive technology. This one also was not involved in this case because there wasn't a freezing of embryos in this case. But only about 25% of embryos created by IVF make it to birth. And human life in biblical worldview begins at conception. That's what the biblical worldview claims, is that life begins at conception. And Christians should not support any reproductive techniques that create embryos that will not be implanted in the womb. So any frozen embryos that don't end up being born is not acceptable in the Christian worldview.
So starting off with the secular perspective, the reason it would be morally unacceptable in our case is because of the health risks that Kim could face during her surrogacy. And it would be acceptable in a secular perspective because of Thomas and Betty's inability to have a child.
The secular worldview assumptions. The factors of secular approach to bioethics perceives ethical theories as primarily reduced to deontological with utilization theories of ethics. It develops principles and rules from the application of these two theories, identifies four major principles: non-anatomy, non-malfinance, benefinance, and justice.
So in the secular worldview assumptions for this, the overall secular societal view of surrogacy is in favor of surrogacy. So in our culture, normally most people that hold a secular worldview would see surrogacy as a good thing and would not see a problem with it. But many secular bioethicists disagree with surrogacy because of the physical trauma, emotional trauma, and the health risks. And pertaining to our case, Kim's body would undergo the stress of pregnancy, which all of us know has a very strong effect on a woman's body while pregnant. And then the emotional trauma, while Kim is volunteering to carry the child, even though she's doing it because she wants to, she would still experience the emotional attachment and the bond that a woman forms when carrying a child, and that's how God made it to be. But even most secular people disagree with it because that bond it's broken when you give away the child.
So for our personal views, my personal view, I quoted Psalms 127:3. It says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward." God gave the people the ability to have children. So if people are not able to have a child, then that is how God intended it. He also intended one man and one wife to have a child. So with surrogacy, that is not always possible. I believe that instead of surrogacy, adoption would be a better option for having a child if you are not able to have your own.
For my worldview, I mentioned Hannah in the Bible who prayed for Samuel, and because it was God's will, he provided her with the child. And while infertility and childlessness is a heartbreaking situation for anyone who goes through it, I believe that God puts people in certain situations for a reason, and I believe that it is not good for a surrogate mother to undergo that emotional and physical trauma that they can go through with surrogacy.
From my personal view, on surrogacy is very supportive, because if someone can't birth a child, I feel that it's our choice to ask someone to carry and birth the child. If someone is having any health problems that is not allowing them to give birth to their child, I believe it's their choice to decide if that's what they want. I also believe that it's no one's choice to have an opinion about it besides the people involved. Because if God allows it to happen, then why stop a woman trying to have their own child or their own kid?